George Armstrong Custer was born December 5, 1839, in New Rumsley, Ohio. His father was Emmanuel Custer and his mother, Marie Kirkpatrick. George moved in with his half-sister in Monroe, Michigan. He attended the McNeely Normal School and graduated in 1856 before attending the United States Military Academy. George Custer went into West Point July 1, 1857. He was now a cadet. He had a troubled time at West Point. In his 4 years there, he got a total of 726 demerits, a record for West Point. For the class of 1861, Cadet George Armstrong Custer scored in dead last place. Despite his later achievements, if you were looking into the young George Armstrong Custer in June 1861, after seeing his attitude and looking over his record, you would think he could never make it in the military. You'd think he'd either end up in jail or be booted out of the army. A roommate of Custer's said it was all right with George Custer, whether he knew his lessons or not. He simply did not allow it to trouble him. But the year was 1861, and the American Civil War was kicking off. In Custer's first year at the academy, there had been 79 cadets, but 4 years later, 23 had dropped out due to their bad grades, and 22 withdrew to join the Confederates with their home states. 1861 had only 34 graduates, and Custer was in last place. After West Point, Custer joined the Army as a second lieutenant and was assigned with the 2nd U.S. Cavalry Regiment. He was sent to Washington, D.C. and trained new recruits. It wasn't until July 21, 1861, when he finally saw action for the first time. Second Lieutenant Custer was at the First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas. During the battle, he was tasked with carrying messages. The battle was the first major battle of the American Civil War. It was a Confederate victory after reinforcements arrived by train. Both sides were very green and had not seen much action. Both sides had 18,000 men engaged in the battle. The Confederates suffered 1,982 casualties, while the Union suffered 2,708. This battle proved that the war could not be won quickly, and it ended with a very disorganized Union retreat back to Washington. It is believed that the Confederacy could have ended the war quickly here if they had acted by seizing the U.S. Capitol, but this never happened. After the battle, Custer went back to Washington and continued training and defending the capital. General McClellan noticed Custer and had him join his staff. He served in the Peninsula Campaign starting in the spring of 1862. He served as an aide to Major General George B. McClellan. Custer was a part of the Siege of Yorktown. During the Peninsula Campaign, Custer earned a reputation for being brave as well as an attention seeker. One of the better-known Custer stories is during the Peninsula Campaign. While the Union was chasing down General Joseph Johnston, the Union hit the Chickahominy River. The generals were standing around the river, and Custer overheard them speaking. One of them said he wished he knew how deep the water was. Custer seized the opportunity and galloped his horse into the middle of the river and shouted back, "McClellan, that's how deep it is, General." After this, Custer was tasked with leading an attack across the river. He and his men captured 50 Confederates, as well as capturing the first Confederate battle flag of the war. McClellan congratulated him. It was around this time when Custer started getting the reputation as a daredevil and publicity seeker. Custer received a temporary field command of captain on June 5, 1862. He was promoted to lieutenant by the Army 12 days later. During the campaign, Custer was the first Union officer in charge of using hot air balloons to spot Confederate positions. He stayed with General McClellan for the Maryland campaign. President Abraham Lincoln fired General McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac in October 1862. In 1863, Custer became an aide to Alfred Pleasonton, who was the commander of the Army's Cavalry Corps. Pleasonton was promoted to Major General and spoke with the new commander of the Army of the Potomac, George Meade. A few generals were fired, and Pleasonton promoted his own generals that he knew would fight. Custer was one of the lucky men. He was promoted to Brigadier General of the Volunteers under Brigadier General Kilpatrick. At this time, Custer had no command experiences at that caliber, just small commands, a few companies at most. He was 23 years old, the youngest to receive the rank and one of the youngest generals in the Army. On July 1, 1863, Lee and Meade's armies met in Gettysburg. Custer was out looking for JEB Stuart's cavalry. They heard the gunfire from the battle that morning. On July 2nd, Custer received orders to disrupt General Ewell's communications. That afternoon near Hunterstown, they spotted Stuart's cavalry. He positioned his men along the road, as well as his artillery, setting a trap. The rebels came charging down the road towards Custer and his men. Custer's horse was shot out from under him, and he lost half of his men in this engagement. Private Norval Churchill rode up and saved Custer by bringing him up on his horse. The Union along the road, as well as the artillery, drove back JEB Stuart's men. After this, Custer and his men rode hard towards Gettysburg, arriving at 2 taverns at 3 in the morning. He received orders the morning of the 3rd to protect General Meade's flanks. Custer was a part of the East Cavalry Field. JEB Stuart arrived north of the East Cavalry Field and signaled to General Lee, which gave away his position. Stuart's goal was to get through the Union flanks and get into their rear. Stuart ordered a cavalry charge, and Custer ordered a counterattack with the 7th Michigan. Custer yet again had his horse shot out from under him. He got another horse and continued the fight. Stuart sent reinforcements, causing the 7th to retreat. Stuart tried again to breach the flank into the Union rear. Both Custer and Towne led the 1st Michigan Cavalry to charge Stuart's approaching cavalry. The two sides met and fought brutally. Custer lost another horse. The Union blocked the Confederate cavalry, causing them to retreat. There were 254 Union casualties and 181 Confederate casualties. A loss for the Confederates, since Stuart failed to complete his mission to break into the Union rear. After Gettysburg, Custer was a part of Philip Sheridan's campaign into the Shenandoah Valley in 1864. General Grant sent Sheridan to deal with Confederate General Early. General Custer took part in a bunch of different cavalry operations, and he also supported many battles. Eventually, Confederate Lieutenant General Jubal Early's army was defeated. Custer was then sent to the siege of Petersburg. He was there throughout the winter. When Lee's lines finally broke, he retreated, and the cavalry played a big part in blocking Lee's retreat. Custer proved himself at Waynesboro, Dinwiddie Courthouse, and at Five Forks. His division blocked Lee's retreat and received the first flag of truce. Custer was sent through the lines and met with General Longstreet. Custer said, "In the name of General Sheridan, I demand an unconstitutional surrender of this army." Longstreet told Custer he was not in command of the army, but if he was, he would not deal with a message from Sheridan. Custer said it would be a pity to have more blood upon the field. Longstreet asked for the truce to be respected and said that Lee was off to meet with Grant and that they would determine the future of the armies. Custer was at the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 15, 1865. Custer was promoted to Major General at 25 years old. He was the youngest Major General in the Union Army. After the war ended, Custer was involved with a very controversial horse theft. Custer's men seized a prized race horse named Don Juan. It's reported that Custer hid the horse. General Grant even ordered Custer to return the horse, but Custer kept it. It's reported that the horse suddenly died a short time later. Custer took a leave of absence in 1866. He looked for a number of different careers outside the Army. He contemplated even taking a Mexican Army military position as adjutant general. His wife did not support this. She didn't want him to take the command. He returned to Michigan after his wife's father had died. He thought about running for Congress. July 28, 1866, Custer was appointed lieutenant colonel of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. He spent some time fighting the Cheyenne in Kansas and Colorado. He eventually went AWOL and was arrested after leaving to see his wife without getting permission. He was suspended for a year, but he returned to duty before the year had passed. He set up supply bases in Indian Territory. In 1868, he led the 7th Cavalry in the Battle of Washita River. It was a victory for the U.S. It forced many Native Americans to go onto the reservations. In 1874, Custer led an expedition with 1,000 men. They went into present-day South Dakota, into the Black Hills. They started towns along their path. The area was Sioux land, and there were reports that there was gold in the area. Gold was found on French Creek, and this sparked the Black Hills Gold Rush. In 1876, Custer had to testify against Secretary of War William Belknap for corruption charges. He didn't want to go, but eventually he had to go and testify in Washington. He testified against Belknap, as well as Grant's brother. Custer asked if he could be excused after testifying. This was successful at first, but Grant stepped in and ordered that somebody else fill in for Custer's military duties. Custer tried to meet with Grant a number of different times to protest this, but Grant denied all requests. Custer disobeyed Grant and left. He headed towards his regiment. Grant was not happy with Custer and ordered that he be arrested. On May 3rd, Custer was arrested in Chicago, and this made the public furious. Newspapers wrote about Grant as a tyrant and a modern Julius Caesar. Grant eventually gave in and released Custer, but made sure Custer did not command the expedition, but General Alfred Terry. Custer was not pleased. Now, we move to the Battle of Little Bighorn. We've already made a full-length video about this, but we're going to go over the basics. Custer's plan was to go after the non-warriors and the Native American camps, capture the women, children, and the elderly, hold them as hostages, and then force the warriors to surrender, and then force them all to go to the Indian reservation. Major Reno's 2nd Detachment were the first to attack a camp on the Little Bighorn. The village was blocked by trees until they got a few hundred yards away. They saw how massive the camp was. They dismounted and fought in a skirmish line. The warriors grabbed their horses and rode out. Custer was supposed to reinforce Reno's troops, but he never arrived. The warriors overwhelmed the men. They raced for the tree line in a retreat. The Native Americans set the woods on fire, forcing the troops out or burning them alive. Reno and his men retreated to the river and were ambushed again. The survivors made it to Reno's Hill, then Captain Banteen's column a short time later arrived. Custer's messenger arrived with a message for Banteen. It said, "Banteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs. P.S. Bring packs." This implied Custer was in a battle and needed help, but Banteen was confused about the message, and Reno would not leave until his men were resupplied. The pack train arrived on Reno's Hill. Heavy gunfire and volleys were heard around 4:20 from the north, but Banteen decided to stay with Reno. They dug rifle pits and set up defenses. Captain Weir left at 5 p.m. to go look for Custer. He spotted a mass of red dust up in the air. At 5:25, he saw a group of Indians on foot and a number on horseback, shooting at objects laying on the ground, possibly wounded soldiers. After the gunfire stopped from the north, Reno and Banteen's men were attacked on Reno's Hill till nightfall, and then most of the next day. General Terry's column eventually scared the Native Americans off when they arrived. It took 2 days for Reno and Banteen to finally learn what happened to Custer. Custer and his 210 men fought at Calhoun Hill in skirmish lines. The survivors retreated to Custer Hill and made up breastworks out of dead horses. Officially, every man was killed. The Lakota later reported that the biggest defense was on Last Stand Hill. The command broke down. The soldiers lasted under half an hour, and every man was killed. Some ran off but were hunted down. Indian accounts said that 40 men, along with Custer, made a final attempt to break out, and all were killed. When the army returned to bury the dead, the men had been mutilated in the worst ways possible. The men were buried where they lay, in shallow graves. It's reported that there was between 2,000 and 5,000 warriors involved in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. A year after Custer's death, he was dug up and reinterred at West Point Cemetery with full military honors. The Battle at the Little Bighorn shocked America and set into motion a downward spiral of hate against the Native Americans. They would suffer tremendously before the end of the Indian Wars. George Armstrong Custer was just 36 years old when he died. He was described as flamboyant, brave, and attention-seeking. He went from last in his class at West Point to the youngest major general in the Army. An interesting man, and a name still known by nearly everyone to this day. I want to thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed, folks. George Armstrong Custer is a very interesting human being, to say the least. He was young when he died, actually the same age I am. He went through a lot of stuff, and he died a brutal, brutal death, but he was also doing very brutal things. Hero or not, whatever. We're just here to tell the story. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you on the next one, people. Peace.